Shabbat Shalom. Do you remember your midlife crisis? You know that one time in your life when you experienced Surus and Vey? It was that one time. You were older than 35, you were younger than 45. And that was it, right? You bought a sports car. Maybe you bought a truck and a camper. Maybe you upended your life and changed careers. Maybe you got a divorce. Maybe you moved across the country. That one time in your life between the age of 35 and 45 when everything you knew became different and you started the next half of your life. Do you remember that one time, that one midlife crisis? If we're to read the psychology books of the 20th century, that's what we're taught. Life is linear and we all go through the same path. And sure enough, older than the age of 35, but younger than 45, there's that one time where you experience crisis in your life. I came across an interesting book this past spring by the author Bruce Feiler. You may know him as the author of Walking the Bible. You might know him as the author of the book Abraham, both of which are phenomenal books. So he wrote a book called Life is in the Transitions. Because as a young guy, he had cancer, and he became a successful author, and he's dealing with a father who's aging, and he started to ask the question, wait a second, I'm not so sure that life is quite as linear as everyone makes it out to be. I'm not sure that the only crisis I'm really going to deal with in my life is between the age of 35 and 45. And I'm not sure it's going to be only one. And so he began this incredible amount of research, and he put forward a thesis that says there's no such thing as a midlife crisis. He put out a thesis that says that over the course of our lives, we're going to experience upwards of 20 disruptors, 20 points in our life where the linear path we thought we were on somehow changes. And he says not only are we going to experience 20 disruptors over the course of our lifetime, but we're probably going to experience at least 3 to 5 life quakes, he calls them. Life quakes. 3 to 5 times over our lives, everything we know and understand about the world will change, will turn. Perhaps it's the death of a loved one. Perhaps it's a divorce. Perhaps it is a pandemic in which everything we thought we knew and understood, everything we did, changed, was upended. And according to Bruce Feiler, not only do we experience 3 to 5 of these life quakes over the course of our lifetime, but that it takes about 5 years to really begin to recover from that. And he talks about the steps of recovery from one of these major life quakes. He talks about the end, the long ending, and how we begin to unpack and understand that life has all of a sudden changed. He talks about the messy middle, in which we take on new rituals and then cast off old rituals, where we experiment with these new rituals and decide whether they're the ones we want, the new way we want to live life, or whether we have to throw those out too and try on new ones. And then he talks about the new beginning. I invite you to think about, in your life, 3 to 5 life quakes. Maybe you haven't had 3 to 5 yet. But a few times when everything you knew all of a sudden changed and was upended. Or the 20 disruptors, the birth of a child, somebody moving cross country, a change in jobs. Or again, the life quakes, living in the midst of a pandemic and trying to figure out what new normal is going to look like. And so we come to this week's Torah portion, Parashat Hayyei, and with it we see not just the end of Sarah's life, but the end of Abraham's life. And we're caused to look back on their lives and reflect, Abraham did not have a midlife crisis. Abraham knew a life of incredible blessing and joy and success, and Abraham knew a life full of Surus and Vey. As we think about Abraham's life, we see at the very end of Parashat Noach that his brother dies, that his father dies, and the next thing we know, God says, Lech lecha, go forth, go to a new land, start over. a new beginning, a new relationship. And sure enough, the moment Abraham and Sarah arrive in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, what happens? Vayirav ba'aretz, there is a famine in the land. Abraham and Sarah are forced to go down to Egypt, where Pharaoh kidnaps Sarah. Ultimately, Sarah is returned to Abraham, and they leave Egypt richer than they could have ever imagined, and they come back to the land of Israel, where Abraham and his nephew Lot are each so rich that they decide they can't share the same piece of land. They have to go their separate ways. We know that Abraham is tested time and again, 10 tests, Pirkei Avot, the Mishnah tells us, including, as we read last week, Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac. And then we come to this week's Torah portion, Hayyei Sarah. And ironically, the Torah portion name for the life of Sarah is really about the death of Sarah. And it says in the beginning of our Torah portion that Abraham mourned for Sarah and he eulogized for her. And if we read the text carefully, we come to see that Abraham took years to mourn the death of his wife. Not only did he have to buy a burial plot for her in the cave of Machpelah, but he also had to tell her story and figure out what her death meant to him and meant to his unmarried son Isaac. And so in the midst of that, Abraham sends his servant Eliezer out to find a spouse for Isaac, who's going to be the perfect Ezer Kenegdo, the perfect helpmate, to build a new generation that's going to inherit this covenant. And so it is that we see toward the end of our Parashat this week that Isaac is comforted over the death of his mother because of the presence of his wife Rebekah. And then we see that Abraham dies. But before Abraham dies, does anyone know what Abraham does? Yell it out if you know it. He gets married again. He has a new wife and a new family. He's got more kids. Abraham marries Keturah. Life quakes and disruptors. Life is not linear. And so if we really begin to unpack what Abraham did over the course of his lifetime, was that in the midst of his life quakes, he didn't rush out. He wasn't looking to buy a new home within 6 months. He wasn't looking to change everything he knew. He stayed present, and he took stock. That's what we see with the death of Sarah. He wailed for her, and he eulogized her, the Torah says. He mourned her loss. He took time, and he took stock of what he was, of who he was, of what they believed in. And then in the midst of that taking stock, he moved forward to help his family and help his kids do what they needed to do. And then, of course, finally, after those many years, finally then did he begin his new beginning with a new wife and a new family before Abraham dies and carries forward. I think there's wisdom in there. All of us over the course of our lives will experience 20 some odd disruptors. Even more on top of that, we're going to experience 3 to 5 life quakes. Like Abraham, let's become mindful in the midst of those life quakes. Let's take our time in them and let's be thoughtful and reflective. Let's help those who are around us as well to be thoughtful and reflective. And then and only then, after trying on new rituals and new lifestyles and new commitments, only then can we begin to move forward into our new normal. And the other thing that I think we take away from Avram Avinu, from Abraham, our ancestor, is in the midst of these disruptors and these life quakes, we turn to our faith, we turn to our community, we turn to our clergy, we turn to our people and our commitments and our traditions, because therein as well is profound comfort, therein as well is people who've gone through similar disruptors, through similar life quakes, who can help us through. This Shabbat of Parashat Hayyei Sarah, let us remember that there's not one point in our life in which we experience crisis. And it doesn't necessarily happen always between the age of 35 and 45, right on schedule, and then the rest of our life is perfectly easy and normal. We experience disruptors and life quakes. Let us be present and mindful in the midst of those, and let us turn to our faith and our people and our community and our traditions to help us through. Adonai ozi amo yitain, Adonai yavorech et amo v'shalom. May God bless us with the strength to turn to the inherited wisdom of our people, to make it through life with joy and with blessing. And even in the midst of our tsuris and vei, even in the midst of our disruptors and our life quakes, may God bless us all with shalom, with wholeness and with peace. And let us say together, Amen and Shabbat Shalom.